At dawn on July 10, 1945, the Argentine fishermen working the waters off Mar del Plata saw something they could not immediately explain. A large vessel was running on the surface toward the harbor entrance in the gray morning light. Not a fishing boat, not a coastal freighter, a submarine, a German submarine. Running low in the water, with no flag flying, except the large white sheet someone had hung from the conning tower, as it cleared the outer breakwater and entered Argentine territorial waters in broad daylight 2 months after Nazi Germany had ceased to exist. Germany had surrendered on May 8, 1945. Every German naval vessel that was still afloat had received the order transmitted by Admiral Karl Donitz on that date: cease all hostilities, surface, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. Dozens of U-boats had obeyed. They surfaced in harbors from Loch Eriboll in Scotland to Lysahawley in Northern Ireland, their exhausted crews hoisting white flags while Allied aircraft circled overhead. It was over. The men who had hunted the Atlantic convoys for 5.5 years had come in from the water and given themselves up. And yet, here was U-530, surfacing in Argentina 63 days after the German surrender, with no logbook, no torpedoes, no personal identification papers among the crew, and a captain who could not satisfactorily explain where his submarine had been, or what it had been doing for more than 2 months since the war ended. This is the story of U-530, the most mysterious submarine voyage of the Second World War, the boat that escaped to Argentina and sparked a legend that has never entirely died. To understand what U-530 actually was and what made its disappearance so suspicious requires understanding the submarine itself. U-530 was a Type 9 sea boat. The Type 9 was the German Navy's long-range design, built specifically for extended patrols far from home ports. Where the standard Type 7 that formed the workhorse of the Atlantic campaign had a range of roughly 8,700 nautical miles, the Type 9C could travel over 13,000 nautical miles without refueling. She measured approximately 251 feet in length and displaced over 1,100 tons surfaced. She carried 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft, with capacity for up to 22 torpedoes. She had a standard complement of between 48 and 54 officers and enlisted men. Her powerful diesel engines, combined with the snorkel device that had been retrofitted to most operational U-boats by 1944, allowed her to run submerged for extended periods while still charging her batteries through the semi-submerged intake tube. She was precisely the kind of boat you would design if you needed to make a clandestine transatlantic voyage undetected in 1945. Long-range, self-sufficient, capable of sustained submergence, built to stay out of sight for weeks at a time. Whether that was what she was actually used for is the question that has never been definitively answered. U-530's wartime career before her final voyage was not exceptional. Under a series of commanding officers, she had conducted 6 combat patrols, sinking 2 Allied merchant ships and damaging a 3rd. Not remarkable by the standards of the Atlantic campaign's early years, though by 1944 and 1945 sinking anything was an achievement given the Allied anti-submarine capabilities that had turned the Atlantic into a killing ground for German submarines rather than for Allied shipping. In January 1945, command passed to Oberleutnant zur See Otto Wermuth. He was 24 years old. It was his first command. U-530 would be the only boat he ever commanded, and he would command it into one of the strangest episodes in the history of naval warfare. Wermuth departed the U-boat base at Horten in Norway on March 3, 1945. His orders were conventional: proceed to the Western Atlantic and disrupt Allied shipping in the approaches to North America. The mission was the same mission the German submarine force had been conducting since 1939, except that by March 1945, the conditions for executing it had changed so completely that the mission was essentially theoretical. Allied air patrols, convoy escorts, and radar coverage had made the North Atlantic so hostile to U-boats that the survival rate for a crew completing a patrol had dropped to statistics that no reasonable analysis could call acceptable. But the orders were what the orders were, and Wermuth sailed. The transit from Norway to the Western Atlantic required passing around the British Isles, mostly submerged. Allied air patrols from Britain and Iceland covered the northern transit routes with an intensity that made any extended surface running suicidal. U-530 crept around the northern passage and entered the open Atlantic. By late April, she was in the waters off the American East Coast, somewhere near the approaches to Halifax and then further south toward New York. It was there that the last combat action of U-530's war took place. In the first week of May 1945, Wehrmacht attempted attacks on Allied convoys near the New York approaches. He fired 9 torpedoes. All 9 either missed or malfunctioned. Not a single hit. This was not a reflection on Wehrmacht's competence as an attack commander. It was a reflection of where the Atlantic War stood in the spring of 1945. Allied convoy routes were screened by aircraft and escorts with such thoroughness that achieving a clean attack solution had become extraordinarily difficult, and the torpedoes that U-530 carried had their own reliability issues by this point in the campaign. 9 shots, 0 hits. The last offensive action of a German submarine in North American waters. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Wehrmacht received the message from Donitz. Surface. Cease hostilities. Proceed to the nearest Allied port and surrender. He did not do this. What he did instead became the subject of international investigation, Allied intelligence interrogation, journalistic speculation, and conspiracy theories that have grown with every passing decade rather than fading. According to Wehrmacht's own later testimony, he doubted the authenticity of the surrender order. He feared it might be an Allied deception designed to lure U-boats to the surface where they could be captured or sunk. He consulted with his officers. He made a decision. U-530 would not be surfacing in an Allied port. Whether this explanation is credible depends on how generously you interpret it. The surrender order was transmitted on the standard Kriegsmarine operational frequencies with authentication codes that Wehrmacht's radio operator would have recognized as genuine. Other U-boat commanders received the same order and surfaced without hesitation. Some scuttled their boats rather than surrender as a final act of defiance, following the Operation Regenbogen, standing orders that Donitz had previously issued. But these crews surfaced before scuttling. Wehrmacht did neither. He turned south. His stated reason was that he believed his crew would receive better treatment in a neutral country than in an Allied prisoner of war camp. He had heard stories about how poorly German prisoners had been treated after the First World War. He did not want that for his men. He had heard that Argentina had a large German-speaking community, and that neutral South American nations were treating German naval personnel humanely. What Wehrmacht did not know, or claimed not to know, was that Argentina had quietly declared war on Germany in March 1945, approximately 6 weeks before the German surrender. Argentina was no longer technically neutral when U-530 turned south to seek its hospitality. The voyage that followed lasted 63 days. From May 8th until July 10th, 1945, U-530 was in the ocean somewhere, running submerged during daylight hours, using the snorkel to charge batteries and run the diesels while hiding just below the surface, surfacing carefully at night to make better speed in the open Atlantic. The route she took has never been definitively established because Wehrmacht disposed of the boat's logbook before entering Mar del Plata harbor. Whatever record existed of where U-530 went between May 8th and July 10th went over the side into the Atlantic. This is the single fact that makes every conspiracy theory about U-530 impossible to definitively disprove. Without the logbook, the record of the boat's course, its positions, its surfacing times, and any passengers or cargo it may have taken on or discharged along the way is simply not there. It does not exist in any accessible form. It either went overboard with the logbook, or it was never recorded, or it is somewhere that no investigation has reached. Wehrmacht also ordered the disposal of the boat's remaining torpedoes before entering port, minus one whose battery had exploded and could not be safely ejected. He ordered the torpedo warheads and gyroscopes thrown overboard. He ordered the coded signal books over the side. He ordered the anti-aircraft ammunition and radar equipment over the side. When U-530 entered Mar del Plata harbor on the morning of July 10th, it was stripped of virtually everything that could identify its mission, its course, or its combat capability. Wehrmacht also admitted to deliberately pouring acid into the boat's diesel motors before entering port, sabotaging them to ensure the submarine could not be easily reused. These actions are consistent with a commanding officer trying to cover up his violation of direct orders, They are also consistent with a commanding officer who had been doing something he did not want anyone to find out about. The Allies who interrogated Vermuth could not establish which interpretation was correct, and neither can anyone today. The physical evidence that greeted Argentine naval personnel when they boarded U-530 was a submarine that had arrived without its logbook, without its torpedoes, without its signal books, without personal identification papers of any kind among the 54 crew members, and with a captain who could only vaguely describe where his boat had been for more than 2 months. The crew had shaved off their beards before entering port, which later took on significance in some accounts as evidence that the boat had been at sea much longer than a direct transit from the North Atlantic would require, though the simple explanation is that men on a submarine after weeks at sea who knew they were about to be boarded by a foreign naval authority might reasonably decide to clean themselves up. The Argentine Navy's immediate response was professional and cooperative. The crew was brought ashore, fed, housed under guard, and the submarine secured. Within days, the Argentine government had notified Allied authorities of U-530's arrival and had agreed to transfer both the boat and the crew to American custody. Argentine officials issued public statements emphasizing that no high-ranking Nazi officials had been found aboard and that the submarine had not landed anyone on Argentine shores. These denials were the specific denials that the conspiracy theories required to exist. Because by the time U-530 arrived in Mar del Plata, the Allied intelligence community and the international press were asking a very specific question. Adolf Hitler was dead, supposedly killed in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945, but Allied confirmation of this fact was incomplete, and many officials were genuinely uncertain. The German body had not been definitively identified. The remains were in Soviet custody. The Soviets were being less than transparent about what they had found. In this context of genuine uncertainty about Hitler's fate, the appearance of a German submarine in Argentina, 2 months after the German surrender, sparked immediate speculation that the boat's real mission had been to spirit senior Nazis out of Germany to safety in South America. Argentine reporters claimed to have seen police reports describing a mysterious submarine landing on the remote Patagonian coast, unloading a high-ranking officer and a civilian, supposedly Hitler and Eva Braun, in disguise. FBI files from 1945 record unconfirmed reports of a German submarine putting ashore somewhere in southern Argentina with Hitler aboard. A Brazilian admiral publicly accused U-530 of torpedoing the Brazilian cruiser Bahia on July 4, 1945, an accusation that would have placed the submarine in the South Atlantic at a time when a direct transit from the North Atlantic would not have required it to be there yet. None of these allegations were supported by evidence that survived scrutiny. The Bahia investigation is worth examining specifically because it illustrates how the legend grew and how it has been systematically dismantled. The Brazilian cruiser Bahia sank on July 4, 1945 in the South Atlantic with heavy loss of life. A Brazilian naval officer speculated publicly that U-530 was responsible. The accusation reached international headlines. The Americans who later interrogated Vermuth pressed him specifically on whether U-530 had attacked the Bahia. He denied it. His crew denied it. And when the Brazilian government conducted its own thorough investigation, it concluded that the Bahia had been sunk not by any submarine, but by the accidental explosion of her own ammunition during gunnery practice. A Brazilian naval gun crew had detonated the ship's own depth charges during a drill. U-530 had nothing to do with it. The Hitler escape theory has been investigated by historians, intelligence agencies, and researchers across 8 decades, and no credible evidence has been found to support it. Allied intelligence analyses conducted in 1945 and 1946 concluded that the physical evidence overwhelmingly supported death in the Berlin bunker. The Soviet evidence that was eventually released in full, combined with forensic analysis of dental records, established Hitler's death beyond serious historical doubt. Whatever U-530 was doing in the South Atlantic between May and July 1945, it was not carrying Adolf Hitler. What it may have been doing is something less dramatic and more consistent with what desperate men in desperate circumstances actually do. The 63-day transit from the North Atlantic to Argentina is approximately twice the time a direct voyage would require. A Type 9C submarine making 10 knots on the surface could cover the roughly 7,000 nautical miles from the American East Coast to Mar del Plata in approximately 29 to 35 days, depending on routing. The extra month of unaccounted time has fueled every theory from a Patagonian landing to a rendezvous with another vessel to a stop at some remote anchorage to take on fuel or discharge cargo. None of these has been established. Wormuth's explanation was that his boat moved very slowly and cautiously to avoid detection, and that the journey simply took longer than a direct transit. This is plausible. A submarine operating entirely on snorkel during daylight and surfacing only briefly at night, staying well away from shipping lanes and established patrol areas, could easily take twice the minimum time to cover the distance. The disposal of the logbook is harder to explain innocently. If the voyage was simply a slow, cautious transit with nothing to hide, the logbook would have recorded exactly that, and its existence would have been the most straightforward piece of evidence supporting Wormuth's account. Destroying it removed the one document that could have definitively established the boat's course and activities. The only rational reasons for destroying it were either to conceal a violation of direct orders, which was already obvious and not particularly consequential given Germany's defeat, or to conceal something the log had recorded that was more seriously incriminating. The Americans and Argentines who interrogated U-530's crew found no crack in the wall of collective denial. All 54 men maintained that no passengers of any nationality had been aboard at any point during the voyage. All 54 maintained that no cargo had been loaded or discharged at any stop. All 54 stated that the boat had proceeded directly from the North Atlantic to Argentina without any diversions. Whether this collective consistency reflects the truth or an agreed story established before the boat entered Mar del Plata harbor, no interrogation could establish. The United States Navy took possession of U-530 in August 1945. The submarine was towed to the Panama Canal and then up the east coast of the United States. That autumn, she made a brief tour of American port cities as a public exhibit, a display of a defeated enemy. Americans who came aboard walked through the narrow passageways where Wormuth's crew had lived for months, and looked at the machinery and the torpedo tubes and the cramped bunks and tried to understand what kind of men had served in a vessel like this and why. The crowds were large. The interest was genuine. The crew was eventually repatriated to Germany in 1947 after approximately 2 years as prisoners. Wormuth himself survived and lived into old age. No charges were ever filed against him or his crew, beyond the implicit charge of disobeying the surrender order, which the post-war legal framework had no mechanism to prosecute. Germany was defeated. Its laws no longer applied. Allied military law had no specific provision for a German officer who had simply sailed somewhere other than where he was told to go. 5 weeks after U-530's arrival, a second German submarine surfaced in Argentina. On August 17, 1945, U-977, commanded by Oberleutnant Heinz Schaffer, arrived at Mar del Plata and surrendered to Argentine authorities. Schaffer had also refused to obey the May 8 surrender order. His voyage had been even more remarkable in one statistical respect. U-977 had spent 66 days continuously submerged in transit, the second longest submerged endurance run in submarine history to that point. The boat had crossed the equator underwater. It had crossed most of the South Atlantic underwater. The physical endurance demanded of the 32 men who remained aboard after Schaffer gave married crew members the option to leave in Norway was extraordinary even by the standards of wartime submarine service. U-977 was a Type 7 sea boat, smaller than U-530, with a shorter range and fewer crew. She had been launched on March 31, 1943, and commissioned on May 6 of that year. She had spent most of her service as a training vessel after sustaining damage to her pressure hull during exercises. When Schaffer took command in December 1944 and finally departed on her first operational patrol in April 1945, the war had less than a month remaining. The boat that had waited years to fight arrived in the Atlantic just in time to watch Germany collapse. The arrival of a second German submarine in Argentina within 5 weeks of the first made the conspiracy theories harder to dismiss. If one boat had made the voyage, it might be an individual commanding officer's decision. Two boats suggested something more coordinated, or at minimum that the idea of Argentina as a refuge had circulated more widely in the U-boat force than official accounts suggested. U-977's arrival reignited every allegation that U-530's arrival had generated. Schaffer was accused of bringing Hitler to Argentina. He was accused of bringing Eva Braun. He was accused of delivering gold. He was accused of stopping at Antarctica. He denied everything until the day he died in 1979. He went back to Argentina after his release and lived there. He wrote a book about the voyage in 1952 titled U-977, 66 Days Underwater. His granddaughter made a documentary and a feature film based on the book in 2014. The story has never stopped being told. The Americans who interrogated Schaffer accused him and his crew of sinking the Brazilian cruiser Bahia, the same accusation that had been leveled at U-530. The evidence was that U-977 arrived with only 10 torpedoes rather than the standard 14, and that the 4 missing tubes were forward-facing, which the Americans argued accounted for the Bahia's sinking. Schaffer denied this and explained that munitions were in extremely short supply at the end of the war, and that 10 torpedoes was simply what was available when they departed. This explanation was eventually confirmed by the Brazilian investigation that established the Bahia was sunk by her own ammunition exploding accidentally. Schaffer had not fired a torpedo in combat. He had arrived in Argentina with exactly the weapons he left Norway with. The British then accused Schaffer of using U-977 to smuggle Nazi leaders, including Hitler, out of Europe. The timing was circumstantially suggestive. U-977 had departed Bergen in Norway on April 16, 1945. Hitler died in Berlin on April 30th. The dates were close enough that some Allied officers genuinely believed the boat might have stopped somewhere to take on passengers before disappearing into the Atlantic. Schaffer denied it. He denied it through British interrogation, through repatriation, through return to Argentina, through writing a book about the experience, through every occasion he was asked until he was no longer capable of being asked. Whether Schaffer was telling the truth is a separate question from whether the accusation was reasonable in 1945. Given the genuine uncertainty about Hitler's fate in the months after the German surrender, given the appearance of 2 German submarines in Argentina within 5 weeks of each other, and given that one of them had arrived with an unexplained 63-day gap in its transit record and no logbook, the suspicion of Allied intelligence officers was not irrational. It was wrong, but it was not irrational. The final fate of U-530 came on November 20th, 1947. The United States Navy had decided the submarine had served its purpose as an intelligence exhibit and a technological study subject. The USS Toro, an American fleet submarine, lined up U-530 in its periscope in the waters off Cape Cod. A single torpedo. The weapon struck U-530 amidships and blew the hull in 2. The boat that had traveled more than 7,000 nautical miles from the North Atlantic to Argentina to avoid capture was sent to the bottom of the Atlantic by another submarine, 60 miles off the American coast in peacetime as target practice. U-977 met the same end in 1946 during naval exercises. The 2 boats that had made the most extraordinary voyages of the final days of the Second World War, that had crossed oceans and equators and spent months hidden beneath the surface of a sea that was no longer at war, were disposed of as test targets. Their hulls lie somewhere on the Atlantic seabed. The water there is cold and dark, and nothing about their condition after decades on the bottom would tell anyone what those submarines were doing during the weeks their logbooks do not account for. What actually happened during U-530's 63 days between May 8th and July 10th, 1945 is not known. It may never be known. The logbook is gone, Wormuth is gone, his crew is gone, the boat is on the Massachusetts seabed in pieces. What survives is the voyage itself as a documented fact, the arrival as a documented fact, the denials as documented facts, and the gap between all of those facts and any satisfying explanation. The historical consensus is that U-530's extraordinary transit was an act of defiance and self-preservation by a young commanding officer who was unwilling to surrender to the Allies, who destroyed his logbook to cover up his violation of direct orders, and who made an exceptionally slow and cautious voyage to Argentina while pretending there was nothing to hide by destroying everything that might reveal whether there was. This explanation is probably correct. It is not entirely satisfying because it does not fully account for the missing month of transit time, and it does not fully explain why a man who was merely trying to avoid a prisoner of war camp would need to be quite so thorough about eliminating every document and piece of equipment that could identify his boat's activities. The legend survives because the facts leave room for it. That is the nature of mysteries that end with the evidence at the bottom of the sea. One man who spent considerable time attempting to reconcile the official explanations with the physical timeline was a retired American naval intelligence officer named Commander Harold Strauss of Baltimore, Maryland. Strauss had been part of the team that interrogated U-530's crew in 1945 when the boat arrived in American custody. He had been in the room when Weymouth answered questions for hours across multiple sessions. He had read every surviving document the investigation produced. He wrote a private memoir in 1971 that his family donated to the Naval Institute Archives in Annapolis after his death in 1983. In the memoir, he described Weymouth as a man who answered questions with the specific quality of a person who has decided precisely what he is going to say, and has rehearsed it to the point where it is the same every time. Strauss noted that this consistency is exactly what a man telling the truth sounds like, and also exactly what a man reciting an agreed story sounds like, and that in his experience of interrogation, the two were genuinely difficult to distinguish without external evidence to check the account against. External evidence was what they did not have. Strauss wrote that he left the interrogation sessions believing Weymouth was not telling him everything. He wrote that he could not prove this. He wrote that in his 25 years of naval intelligence work, the specific quality of incompleteness he detected in Weymouth's answers was something he had encountered in other contexts, and that it was distinct from lying and distinct from telling the truth, and that it occupied the specific territory between those two things, where a man tells you everything that is technically true while withholding the one thing you actually need to know. He wrote that he never found out what that thing was. He wrote that he was still thinking about it in 1971. The submarine still lies off Cape Cod where the USS Toro put it. The water there is cold, and the visibility is poor, and nothing about the hull's condition after decades on the seabed would tell anyone what U-530 was doing between May and July 1945, even if a diver reached it tomorrow. The logbook is somewhere in the Atlantic, rotted beyond recovery. The men who could have answered the question are dead. The story ends where all genuine mysteries end. Not with a revelation, but with the permanent absence of one. U-530 sailed from Norway in March 1945 as a weapon of war. It arrived in Argentina in July 1945 as something else entirely. Exactly what that something else was, Otto Weymouth took with him when he died. Wherever that was, at whatever age, in whatever country, he did not leave a record. The boat that came in from the ocean in the Argentine dawn was stripped clean of everything that could explain it. It has stayed that way ever since.